right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I'm very excited today to be joined by two previous really inspiring guests, Robyn Gobbel and Marshall Lyles. Welcome, both of you.
Hey, Guy.
Hey, thanks for having us.
All right, so Robyn was previously on episode 402. She has over 15 years of practice in family and play therapy, specializing in complex trauma, attachment, and adoption. Robyn's diverse clinical training includes EMDR, somatic experiencing, trust-based relational intervention, circle of security, parent educator, and a bunch of other things that I'm not going to read again here. Robyn has integrated these training modalities with a foundation of attachment theory and the relational neurosciences to create an attachment-rich, sensory-sensitive, and relational neurosciences-supported healing environment for children and families. Marshall joined me previously on episodes 152 and 393. He is an EMDRIA Approved Consultant and also has over 15 years of practice in play and family therapy. He has extensive speaking and training experience and has worked in a variety of mental health settings. Most of his clinical practice has focused on attachment trauma and its effect on family relationships. He conducts supervision and consultation sessions with counseling professionals and leads training in both parenting and professional settings. All right. So, as I've said before in this podcast, I mean, you guys are here. It's not an accident. What you guys talk about individually really resonates not only with me personally, but what this podcast is about. And Marshall, you had, I think you introduced me to Robyn. Mm-hmm. And then after I had Robyn on, I was like, amazing. And then you said, well, let's do something together. And what did you say there? Let me ask you to kind of repeat that for our listeners.
Yeah, one of the things I like about the content and what you try to do here, Guy, is encouraging new trauma therapists how to elongate their career and get the most out of everyday work without falling into burnout. And those themes are so important in the intensity of work that we do. And one of the most pivotal things that's happened for me in my career is when Robyn and I started falling into rhythm of getting to do some things together. And even the times that I'm, because we live far apart from one another, even the times when I'm on my own, I've internalized our working relationship in a way that's impacted how I think and do the trauma work. And so that it just felt like maybe some encouragement we could start to talk about how to find collaborating partners and how to remove some of the aloneness that comes from doing this really important and really hard work.
Okay. Robyn, let me ask you to jump in here. How did you guys meet?
So we knew each other like of each other in our community. We, both lived and practiced in Austin for a long time. And we knew of each other, right, Marshall?
That's right.
But didn't really know each other. We knew we were both doing the same work, and I can at least speak for myself and say highly regarded Marshall. Like, he had a great reputation, was doing great work. And then I think we finally like met each other in person, maybe like in 2012, if I had to guess. It was at a training in Houston, I think. And for a couple years, sort of continued that peripheral relationship. We knew of each other, we respected each other, we saw each other at trainings, but weren't extremely connected until I decided I wanted Marshall to help me earn the registered play therapist credential, which then propelled us to having to be together a lot. Through all that consultation. And I think, Marshall, correct me if I'm wrong, it was right at the end of, like, we had this like power session in your office of just working towards finishing up these hours and this credential. And it was like, well, okay, so what's next? We should teach together. And so we just came up with something to teach.
Nice.
And then I would say, through how much we've taught together now, it's been probably 3+ years, how we've just become such really good friends.
Cool. Very cool. And we'll talk about your teaching kind of later on. We'll get into that and exactly what that looks like. But Marshall, start off here. Bring us into context.
Yeah. one of the things that, and I echo what Robyn was saying, that we felt kind of an instant respect through reputation. I was honestly a little intimidated to meet Robyn in person, but we found such similar humor, and the things that brought us joy were really congruent, and so we found our way into playfulness with ease. And one of the things that we found really interesting is, population-wise, we were both primarily working with attachment trauma. We had lots of similar training. We had a philosophy that was so compatible, and yet so much of the expression of what our work looked like in offices and even in our personalities is dramatically different. And so that became really attractive and interesting. And it became more and more that we were exploring about, well, how do you do that? And what does it sound like? And it became interesting to almost become bilingual, and knowing the other way to speak attachment language and the other way to do trauma work. My more introverted, I would say, I have a lot of expressive arts and those sorts of work. And then Robyn being just so much gifted with words and so expressive naturally, so into music and movement and those things that terrify me to no degree. So it became this challenge as well as this encouragement to get to hear the compatibility and differences that we were working with.
Robyn, why don't you kind of comment on what Marshall just said? Give us your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, we have so many similarities and so many fantastic differences. Like Marshall speaks play therapy better than I do, right? Like when we first kind of merged together, we were talking about the same thing, but he had this one set of language and I had more of the attachment, relational neurobiology language. And we were saying the exact same things, but with different language, different nuances. And so that was really fun to merge those and to see, like, how are we speaking the same thing? What's different? You know, how are we complementing each other? And then again, I think some of it is personality. Marshall tends to err more towards, introversion, which nobody's would ever describe me as introverted. And the way that we kind of would co-teach, and his background in more expressive arts and sandtray, and my background in working with these highly dysregulated kids who were, spinning and upside down. And I hung this hammock in my office and had a trampoline in my office and was just like, constantly engaging my body. And in fact, couldn't get Marshall to come to my body workshop. So many convenient excuses every time.
Okay.
I think I started getting really creative with the excuses. But when I found my way to it, and what finally happened in Denver.
Finally, yeah.
I knew what you were doing, but to see it happen was a completely different experience for me. I found myself like being pulled towards, the activities that people were doing and wanting to join in. So yes, even I couldn't avoid it once it was in my eye line.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really fascinating, and I just want to pull this out for our listeners, is, both of you talked about a shared philosophy, and this kind of underpinning of a commonality, and what you're kind of talking about is very similar, and yet they're being expressed in different ways. It's manifesting in different ways. And I think that's a really good lesson, takeaway for our listeners who might be thinking, well, I'm really interested in play therapy or attachment therapy or whatever, and maybe it has to look a certain way. And that's, I think, there's a lot of freedom in what you're both saying. I really like that.
Yeah, I like that too. And I think part of what makes trauma therapy hard isn't just the therapy, but often the way that therapists treat one another and speak of one another. There's a lot of competition and kind of one-upsmanship that can come in our field, sadly, and speaking about different approaches with disdain and disrespect. And so then there's this, I think that enlarges the imposter syndrome that's out there, is that people are constantly hearing how other therapists are being spoken of, and just then by assumption, you must believe other people are thinking that of me and my approach. So it has been really a healing experience for me to get to be with Robyn and to understand how much mutual respect there can be, even when approach and style and expression is different. I've found it to be, as one of our favorite teachers would say, a completely, what is Bonnie's word? Not disconfirming. It's been a disconfirming experience from my previous collaborations.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of bring it into this topic of what is it? Burnout, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, I think burnout is part of it, but almost some of the symptoms or precursors even that might start is I start to watch new therapists lose conviction about what they believe. I continually watch in supervision how therapists aren't trusting their own intuition, and they're not really leaning into how their personal self integrates with their model, with their theory. And so much of that.
Robyn, you're shaking your head. Yeah.
If we can find ways to talk about that and to see other people live, Robyn and I have these dialogues together in front of people about, how I would say that different, but how drawn I am to, your approach, Robyn, and in the moments when I hear you talk about it. We're hoping that we can model for others what it's like to embrace self and to bring that into a right brain version of the trauma work that can happen whenever you're really surrounded in good, solid community.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most common pieces of feedback that Marshall and I get when we teach together, and we get this whether we're teaching online like this, so we've run webinars together where we both have our screens open like this, but then nobody else has their screen. And then, of course, we've co-taught together in person, is we're regularly told that the resonance that's created between the two of us alivens and allows people to embody exactly what we're talking about, which is like the cultivation and co-creation of resonance between therapists and clients. So being able, which wasn't, certainly we didn't sit down with that goal, like, hey, Marshall, we should make sure we're very resonant because that will really inspire, like that was just feedback that we started getting. And it was really exciting when people were saying that they were getting that from us, like virtually online. I thought that was really amazing. But when we pull it back to like trauma therapist work and whether you want to call it self-care or burnout or, what being with Marshall has meant, like being with somebody with shared philosophy, and not just like, we both work from an attachment perspective, but we have shared philosophies about like humanity. And Marshall, I would imagine you remember like the lunch that we had together where I said, like, I just learned this thing from this mentor. And she said, which guy I talked about at my last podcast with you, like, I've never met a true self I haven't fallen in love with. And Marshall's just like, so I guess, if we're going to believe that about our clients, we're going to have to believe that about ourselves, huh? I'm like, oh, yeah, dang it. That is so much hard work. But like being in...
I think that conversation just got edited for appropriate podcast.
Yes, language. This is family. Yes. So, but to work with somebody that like embodies that belief in the same intensity that I embody it is so freeing, right? Like I don't have to worry about making mistakes. I don't have to worry, like all of my voices that are like, I'm too big, I take up too much space in the relationship, I'm too this, I'm too that. Like, I just don't have to worry about that with being in collaboration with
Mm-hmm.
somebody who, again, it's not just clinically we're on the same page. We're like on the same page about our beliefs about people.
What I'm getting, if I may, is this, and this acceptance of who each of you are, professionally, personally, and even in collaboration. And yeah, you can feel it. And of course, that's making me, and I can see how you got that feedback. Other people say, yeah, wait a minute, I'm like X, Y, and Z. I can own that. This is, and of course, that's going to feed off of and resonate with someone in the room.
Yeah.
But let's skip back to Marshall. What you were saying initially is that's not always easy.
No.
I mean, wait a minute. You're asking me to accept the fact that I'm an introvert or not an introvert, and what that's going to look like, et cetera?
Yeah. I remember, Robyn, at one point, this will probably be a conversation you remember as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a narrative that I would often tell myself of, because I'm an introvert, I also don't really enjoy being with large groups of people in a way where I feel known by all of them at the same time, or people trying to enter into my world, that I get really anxious. And she said something very clearly like, I believe part of you believes that, but there clearly have to be other parts of you that are welcoming it because it's happening. And that rattled me for weeks to realize, oh wait, this is just the version of the story I've been telling myself. I have other parts that are not compatible with that narrative and that story, that deserve to be cared for and heard and honored. And she said it with such straightforward gentleness that, it packaged it in a way that I couldn't help but let it hang out in my mind for a little bit. After, I probably drank a little for a minute, and then we moved right into, I have to have a follow-up dialogue with you about this. And so that became a part of our conversation for a little while. It's hard to let people see you in the moment, especially the parts of you that you feel like you have to cover up in order to be a good enough therapist.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you push through that, and the seeing and the being known that someone offers you professionally, that then allows you to see, oh, those parts I've covered up are going to make me a greater therapist. Those are the parts that are going to make me inviting to people. It's healing eventually. It's just scary at first.
Robyn, jump in there, because I love this, but I want you to have an opportunity to talk.
Yeah.
Here on this.
Well, I absolutely remember that conversation, and I remember a little bit of a risk, a little bit of like, listen, I'm sort of calling you on this narrative that you have for yourself, and also being able to self-reflect on like, man, this is so awesome that we have the strength in our relationship that we can say these things, and that I've had similar experiences that the feedback I get in the world is that I'm big, and I take up a lot of energy and a lot of space. And like, even at the beginning when Marshall said that he used to maybe feel a little intimidated by me, I had to have a little internal like self-soothing about like, that's not criticism. Because people always say that about me. I'm kind of intimidating. And I always hear that as, oh, I'm doing something wrong. That's so critical. And I'm like, that's not criticism. Like, Marshall would never criticize me like that. And so that allows me again to like pull in this new little narrative. And in general, I actually prefer to hang out with therapists who kind of match my energy a little bit more. And so being with Marshall in a way that we have more of a mismatch, I think has actually even been more healing. Like, we can be totally different. We can show up in the world in completely different ways. And that's wonderful. That's perfect. That's fantastic. We just get to be who we are. And then that's so beautifully reflected when we co-teach, because oftentimes there's parts of our group who are really connected with Marshall and really resonate with him and kind of his way of being. And then there's people who really resonate more with me. So we give these people this experience of, I think, being kind of seen and mirrored because we are so different from each other.
How does, and how does this acceptance of what these parts, different parts of oneself, again, I'm putting myself in the position of the listeners here. How does that translate into the therapy room?
I love that question.
Yeah.
Go for it, Robyn.
I mean, my first thought is, how does it not, right? That if I'm going to hold this belief, like all parts of you are welcome here, which I really believe is a core part of therapy work. All parts of you get to come here. I want to see and know all of them, even though the parts that you're the most ashamed of or the most afraid of or whatever, the parts you believe are the most harmful, that I can only create that experience for a client if I really believe that about myself. And if I'm going to believe that about myself, I have to come into contact with people who are mirroring that back to me. Like that's not an isolating journey for me. You know, that's something I've come into believing because of my experience with other people. And I really believe that that's a core philosophical piece that's different when you walk through like the threshold of my office or walk through into Marshall's office, that it's just so clear even before it's explicitly stated. And I explicitly state that as well, that all parts are welcome.
So for you, Robyn, specifically, I mean, you know, we're talking about accepting these different parts of ourselves. And again, we're talking in part here about Dick Schwartz's work, right? IFS, internal family system, and parts work, et cetera. But okay, I'm listening to this podcast. What you're telling me I need to accept, or I have to accept this part of me that I don't like, this part of me that I'm ashamed of. I mean, this doesn't happen just like that.
It sure doesn't. Marshall and I are both, I actually come to this more through the lens of like Bonnie Badenoch's Inner Communities work about parts. And absolutely, I actually would probably use the word compassion towards parts more even than acceptance. Like that word just resonates with me more fully. And you're right. It's absolutely not, you know, instant, oh, okay, I'm supposed to have compassion towards this part of myself that causes me a lot of pain or causes people that I'm in relationship with a lot of pain, or I'm ashamed of how that part acts or behaves. That it is, you know, there's a lot of work there. And for me, I've done a lot of that work with my own therapist, but truly I've done a lot of that work like in relationship with peers, in particularly Marshall, which then comes back and impacts the richness of the work that I've done in the therapy room.
How have you done it in relationship with him?
Well, sometimes we're just flat out talking about it, right? Like there's a part of me that's afraid that if I take charge of this project, you're going to think that I'm really bossy and you're going to get annoyed and irritated and you're going to say, peace out. You don't want to work with me anymore. Right. And so we're just having these like, how can I know for sure that that's not going to happen? So we're straight up like using this language, and whenever we're noticing something coming up, you know, or while we're co-teaching, like, oh, that part of me that gets really big and really energetic is feeling a ton of shame right now. Like I'm having huge vulnerability, like hangover from this. And then we talk about it.
I'm hearing safety within this relationship too.
Yeah.
Which is big. I mean, it's interesting, you know, we're talking at one time about your relationship and kind of using that as a model for how the qualities of that can be really beneficial for not just new therapists, but all therapists, and how that can translate into the room. I mean, I just love this topic because I feel it makes me feel free, and it makes me feel, and I love the way you made that distinction between attachment and compassion. There is a difference there, and it's just like, okay, I can have compassion about this particular part of me.
Yeah.
And you know, sometimes I think it even goes a step further. of, can I then eventually get to enjoyment of that part? You know, kind of delighting in that part, which is a word that Robyn and I bring into almost every training we do, is let's not even have to stop at compassion. What would it be like to move to delight? And how could we get there? And that, you know, as Robyn said, we both are such advocates for therapists doing their own therapy, for doing the work in their own families, for being in consultation. But this part in particular, this being in community and collaboration with other people who are similar to you, when Robyn delights in one of my parts that I'm not sure belongs in the therapy room, I trust it in a way that's different from all those other relationships, because she's doing the work I'm doing. And it brings a little bit more of an instantaneous permission to lean into that a little bit more when I'm alone with the client, because I know she understands more quickly what I'm trying to communicate about being a therapist. And it's brought some freedom in the journey towards delight that I think I'd been looking for a long time.
So this quality of having compassion and even acceptance towards these different parts of ourselves, for a therapist, you know, Robyn, you were like, well, how can it not translate into the room? But let's dial in even further and talk specifically about working with someone who's been impacted by trauma. What does that mean for a client who's been impacted by trauma? What does that mean to be sitting with someone who has compassionate for these different parts of themselves? What is that going to look like? How is that going to literally translate to the therapy?
So we wanted to do a little kind of left brain neuroscience-y talk. I mean, compassion is a part of an integrated state of the nervous system. And so if I can hold in mindful awareness this part of myself, which maybe does have repercussions in my life or does have some negative behaviors, or I've traditionally been angry at or ashamed of, but I can hold and like literally have a disconnection, you know, be able to see that part, can think about that part without being consumed by that part, and have a curious, you know, state of, I wonder what that part's job has been. I wonder what happened that caused this part to think it needed to work this hard. I want, like, this part knows there's consequences, but it still believes it's needed. And so what's driving that? And to shift into this curious, compassionate state of the nervous system is, from a neurobiological language, like shifting into a state where now integration is possible, and widening that window of tolerance and integrating these dissociated parts of self only as possible when we're in an integrated state. And now I, as the therapist, have to have done my own inner work, because without question, we're going to be implicitly triggered by what's happening for our clients. And if I get too triggered where I'm losing my own integration, I can't hold that curious, compassionate, integrated space in the therapy room. And the only way to really be able to do that is to have done my own work, so that I can maybe see a part come alive, like, ooh, I really resonate with this client on this thing, but I'm seeing it come alive. I'm holding it in compassion, and I'm staying integrated, which then allows my client's nervous system to just sort of kind of gently move towards integration, because we all always are. What do you think, Marshall?
Yeah, it reminds me of a subject we spend so much time on, but when we talk about rupture and repair, that the less a therapist knows themselves, the more likely they are to bring rupture into the therapeutic relationship without noticing it. And then we lose all that wonderful opportunity for repair, which is when the most modeling of acceptance and compassion and delight have been, as you say, enlivened in the room. And so I think it's these dialogues outside of the room that then bring that integrated therapist into the room, who's more self-aware, and then can hold and notice whenever ruptures show up, which I think is probably the most misunderstood topic for new trauma therapists who think they're meant to avoid ruptures at all costs, instead of just saying, I acknowledge ruptures have to happen because we're imperfect humans, and my job is to notice them without freaking out and to welcome the repair opportunity that shows up. I think that's a big part of how this work outside of the room starts to translate into the trauma client.
Do you guys teach a course on this stuff?
What do we do, Robyn?
I'm thinking to myself, if you do, damn, this is amazing. Well,
Robyn, why don't you talk about that?
I mean, we've done an online course similar to what Marshall just talked about, and we have a 3-day course that we call Embodying the Neurobiology of Attachment, which is very different from your typical like therapist training, and that you don't go to learn tools and techniques, you go to become to be in a space where you can do self-exploration. And we work to create safety and then kind of aliven and welcome these parts into the room in the training. And then we do work to come into contact with them and have compassion with them and share them with, somebody who can hold these parts. And then we weave that in with like didactic information, as well as, okay, well, this is great. So this is all fantastic, but what does it actually mean in the therapy room? So we weave that all together. And then we're going to try our hands at a longer 5-day intimate retreat experience this summer, where we hope to just expand further this idea of the inner community. And we're all coming into this work with our own inner parts, and the ways that we allow those to be useful in the therapy room instead of kind of hindering is by growing in relationship with our inner community, but doing it in community, that it's not work to do alone. It's work to do with other people who are also embodying the, like, all parts are welcome here, belief. So the short answer is yes, we do teach this. It's fun.
I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Robyn Gobbel and Marshall Lyles. I'll have their information linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So kind of circling back, with kind of newer therapists in mind, even newer trauma therapists in mind, is this a challenge? Is this something that is not taught out of the gate? Is not what would you say to that?
Oh, new therapists come out of grad school, understandably so left-brained.
Yeah.
Everything has been so information heavy. They've been graded repeatedly. And so there's this performance element that's necessarily a part of getting a degree. And so it is a tough invitation to immediately let that go and to then believe that it's really the right brain presence that's going to be the most impactful aspect of healing that clients have. And so I do think new therapists often have a tough ask when, people like us show up and say, okay, now we're going to switch all that around. All of that is wonderful. Know your theory so it becomes intuitive. And now you need to know yourself in order to bring it alive in the room. It's not always immediately welcomed. I think.
As I've said before on this podcast, I was a classic example of that. When I went back to graduate school, I was kind of an older student, and I had been in therapy. I kind of thought I had done my work, so I was that person who was just trying to consume all that information because I thought that was going to be that which made me, the best therapist that I could become at the time. And of course, I found out the hard way in a sense, but this topic is again just so inspiring to me because it's almost like that free ticket to be yourself as simple and trite as that sounds, but how powerful that is when you're sitting in the room with someone who can embody that, and how that resonates,
Mm-hmm.
And for someone who's been impacted by trauma, it's almost the antithesis of that, right? There's always the shutting down of stuff. And yeah, man.
Yeah. And I relate to that. I remember, my own therapist, all parts are welcome, blah, blah, blah. And being like kind of angry about it. Like, that doesn't, I don't believe you. That doesn't make sense. There's this one part of me that's terrible. In fact, probably the best thing we could do is if you could grow like my good protective parts, as opposed to like, let's just ignore, so I really relate to the, like, no way, you've got to be kidding me. Like, how can we really welcome on all parts of self? And I've worked through that as well, to be able to say, like, no, we really can. It's not my agenda to determine if a client does or doesn't do that, but it is my responsibility to hold that, create that environment for them. Mm-hmm. That I can't control if you are going to welcome all of your parts of self, but I do, and I'm going to keep showing up every week and keep doing what I need to do to be clear about that.
So you're, just for me to be clear, you're saying you can't determine whether a client is going to welcome all of their parts, but you are going to welcome all their parts.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Nice.
And that conviction can only be communicated when it's congruent. So that's going back to what Robyn was saying earlier. If you as a therapist have not welcomed your parts, you can never really adequately convince someone to accept the invitation of their parts being welcomed.
Yeah.
And so it's just so much responsibility on us to continue to do all the things we need to keep track of our inner community, to be listening to those aspects that show up, and to be receiving care that we need in order to convince ourselves that we can be trusted.
Awesome. All right, guys. Robyn, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
My website, gobbellcounseling.com.
Okay. And how about for you, Marshall?
Same, marshalllyles.com. There's a whole lot of L's there in the middle. You just got to keep going.
Keep going with those L's.
Okay.
It's true.
Now, as far as collaborative work between you guys, is there a website they can go to? How are people going to learn about what you guys are doing together? We
both have it on both of our websites, right?
Okay.
Typically, people do actual registration through my website. That's my, like, I'm going to get this done part of me. But we both have all the information on both of our websites. Okay. When's the next workshop you guys are doing? So we are in Fort Worth at the very beginning of March. And then Olympia, Washington for the 3-day attachment workshop again in June. And then our inner parts retreat, 5-6 day retreat is in July. Okay, awesome. Yeah. I'll get those linked up. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back and share. This was awesome. Thanks, Guy.
Thank you.
And thanks,
all right,
Marshall.
take care.
Bye.
Bye.